your opponent. So get your hands on some of these solvers, Mathway, Photo Math. I was able to do this in the spring by sending out a lot of nice complimentary emails to the companies and, informing them of my position. I sent them, the URL for my institution that showed myself as a faculty member, along with my email address, to confirm that, yes, I am a professor and this is, I'm not some student looking for free access. It's important not to be combative, no matter how we might feel about the role that solvers play in our students and their educations. Being nice goes a long way, and make sure that you follow their terms of service. If they do give you a free account, follow their terms of service. Most of them block, have ways of recognizing if you're sharing your account with other professors. You don't want to get your free account disabled by sharing it around with other professors and triggering some violation of their terms of service. And the thing you want to do is you just start pointing their app at different problems. You've got a set of problems that you're thinking about using for your exam. Start looking at different randomizations of those problems and see what the automated problem solvers will make of your problems. And what you want to keep your eye out for is oddities. Some of the things that I noticed in the spring when we were developing final exams, and as I was writing my own exams, frankly, was one, that a lot of online problem solvers really prioritize even in odd symmetries for trig functions. So I tried to pick randomizations for my exams that often included some kind of sine or cosine or tangent of negative coefficient on my variable. And, when student work began by simplifying out those negatives, I kind of had an idea of, all right, maybe they're not doing this entirely on their own. Same thing with integration techniques like trig substitution, partial fraction decomposition. When you're asking students to use a particular strategy for solving problems, a lot of these solvers, they don't take instruction well. They look at the symbols and they do their best guess at like, what's the most efficient way to solve this problem? And it's not always the way that you would want students to solve it. So again, you kind of want to familiarize yourself with the ways in which these different automated solvers respond to, symbolic requests for a solution. And really what this all comes down to is incorporating some interpersonal aspect to your assessment strategy. Because again, if all you're doing is giving, whether it's a WeBWorK problem, whether it's a PDF, static problems, whatever it is, however you deliver your problems, if there's no interpersonal aspect to your assessment, then you're really just relying on the student's written work. And, in these times, whether or not it was an automated solver or not, students have access to, cousins, friends, the internet at large to come up with a solution that ends up at the right answer that maybe they don't fully comprehend. And this is an opportunity for us to kind of work that into our assessment strategy. And the thing to focus on here is that, we want to focus on having our students explain themselves and justify their thought processes. It's not so much about interrogating them or trying to get them to confess that, oh yes, I used this solver or that solver, or I copied this or I didn't. It's really to emphasize how comprehension is an important fundamental component of what it is that you have as a priority for your students coming out of this class. It's not simply you're taking calculus so that you can leave this class and take derivatives or integrals. It's that you understand the concept of what a derivative is and how it can be used, or how integrals play a role in solving larger problems. Another thing to do is look to Bloom's taxonomy. Look, this wouldn't be a talk about assessment strategies if we didn't talk about Bloom's taxonomy. So incorporating some higher order tasks into your exam, your assessment strategies is going to be important. Incorporating application is a pretty easy one to do. Fold some word problems into your assessments. You can't exactly point your camera at a word problem and have Mathway tell you what the answer is. Right? Students are being required to, put together the information that you give them and construct a solution from the context of the problem. And that's something that automated solvers are simply just not able to do. Now, word problems are pretty difficult to randomize, but gratefully, WeBWorK supports randomization through static problems as well. I think Kate is going to talk about that in the next talk, how you can incorporate static problems into your randomization strategies. Asking students to analyze their results. So pulling in, even just multiple choice. I know WeBWorK doesn't deal well, you can, but WeBWorK doesn't make it easy to deal with open-ended questions. Like if you were to ask your students to explain their work, sure, they can type out a lot of things, but WeBWorK is not going to be able to automatically assess whether or not their justification is valid. So again, like having an interview component is important for this. But you could also just incorporate WeBWorK, does multiple choice questions, asking them to interpret or draw conclusions about what does their answer mean? What's the relevance of the answer that they came up with? Even though it is multiple choice and some students might guess, having that as one piece of a longer question can definitely go a long way towards, okay, do you understand what it is that you're doing? And do you understand why you're doing the calculations that you're doing? And what does your final answer actually mean? And finally, synthesis. I like these problems a lot. Reversing what we normally think of as the problems that we give to students. So instead of, I'm thinking of a particular question that, that I wrote for last year. Instead of asking students to take an algebraic representation of a rational function and say, what are the vertical asymptotes? What are the horizontal asymptotes? What are your intercepts? Turning that around and saying, okay, these are your asymptotes, these are your intercepts, come up with a rational function that has these features. Students are then required to think differently. And it's not something that automated problem solver can handle well either. And then you can abstract the unnecessary components of your assessment questions. Without being too explicit, can you ask students the questions with giving them less information? So for instance, breaking down a large problem, separate your task into smaller components and separate the procedural steps from their application. So ask students to do procedural things. That's definitely a part of math assessment, but giving them separate questions where they're required to take, let's say, instead of giving students a function and saying, what's the tangent line, give me the equation of the tangent line at x equals 2. Instead, ask them to take derivatives in one problem. Can you procedurally find the derivative of a given function and separate that from the application of what the derivative is and say, okay, well, you have a function and its derivative at this value is -3. Determine from this information what the equation of the tangent line is. And so in that sense, they're putting together the use of the derivative separately from actually finding it in maybe a more procedural fashion. So if you don't need to make a function explicit, don't. I'm thinking again of things like fundamental theorem of calculus, where you don't have to provide the function. You can say what the integral of a function is from 1 to 5, and you can say what the integral of that same function is from 2 to 7, and ask students to piece those things together in order to find, to draw other conclusions about the integral of that same function where the function itself is unknown. So again, you can't really point your camera at a function that you don't know. It's not about technically computing the antiderivative and evaluating at the boundaries. It's about piecing together from the limited information that you provide. And again, it separates, minor technical errors that might happen when computing an antiderivative. It separates that into its own separate question. You assess that separately from, putting the concepts of what an integral represents. And again, you end up with a question that's more procedural that maybe a solver would help with, and a separate question where a automated solver is just not really going to do you much good. And then third, you could always represent your functions as graphs. Give a geometric representation rather than an algebraic one. Again, if you still on the mindset of like derivatives or integrals, providing a graph of a function, maybe a piecewise linear function, and asking students about the integral of the absolute value of this function. You don't have to provide the explicit representation of the function in order to ask interesting and illuminating questions that show whether your students really comprehend what it is that that they're doing when they take an integral. And again, a little goes a long way. Like I'm not here to recommend that you eliminate procedural questions from your assessments at all. It's about striking a balance between having procedural questions and having conceptual questions, and making sure that there's a balance between those two, and using your problem weights effectively so that you set the standard. What threshold do students need to reach in terms of answering procedural questions, in terms of answering conceptual questions, in order to achieve that passing grade that students are ultimately focused on. But if you're weighting your exams too heavily on technical proficiency, these are places where students can leverage the automated problem solvers and give you correct answers with valid work. And again, if you're not incorporating an interpersonal, like an interview aspect to your assessment, then it becomes very difficult to justify telling the student, well, I can't pass you, even though you have right answers and you have valid work, because then it comes down to a dispute of did you cheat or did you not cheat, and then it becomes becomes combative, and it can be a difficult situation for both parties. Like it wears on our enjoyment of teaching when we have to fight these battles. And also, finally, a big component of this is preparing yourself and your students, for that matter. Having coming into this with a prepared mindset and setting expectations is super important. So, your students are going to need to know well in advance, like what your policy is for determining whether or not they're passing on an exam or not. And then this is very important when you incorporate in-person interviews. How much does that count for? What is it that you're looking for? What are the demarcations for students to know that they'll be able to come into an interview and prove to you that they're passing, that they get it? How do I get a passing grade is ultimately the question that they want answered the most. And so having these things laid out in advance is super important, so that your students don't come in all stressed out, because that can also get in the way of their ability to show you exactly how much they understand. If they're stressed out because they don't know what success looks like to you, it can be counterproductive. And when it comes to suspicions, you've done your homework, you've taken a look at what these automated problem solvers generate as work, and maybe you have your suspicions about a student, it really doesn't serve you well. It doesn't serve them well to approach this from a confrontational standpoint. You might want, I know I get, I may take things a little personally when students cheat in my class. I have a very hard time, keeping that part on a leash. But students, they don't respond well to being accused, and it doesn't generally go anyplace productive. The key here is keeping your focus on having the students explain their work and folding in your expectations in terms of what you set as far as your grading policy is concerned is super important to making this go smoothly. When you set that expectation that okay, yes, the correct answer is worth some points, and yes, the right written work is worth some other points, but when you come into the interview, if you're going to read to me what your written work says, that's not an explanation. Like how students understanding, how you're going to evaluate the interview, super important. And finally, what's the fallout? Like whether a student cheated or didn't cheat at the end of the day, whether they used a solver or didn't use a solver, did they copy it directly, or did they just use the solver to kind of like guide them through the steps? We want to help them grow from that ultimately, right? Students might have even picked up some of these odd techniques from doing their homework with these solvers as assistants. And so, they end up potentially being more confused because the automated solver isn't going to explain things the way that you explain them in class. And so they're getting conflicting messages, and maybe they don't understand what you explained in class. So they're looking somewhere else for something that makes more sense. And they use these solvers and they try to make it make sense to themselves, but none of it fits together. Like it's our job to kind of help them come to an understanding, right? And so by emphasizing the aspect of explaining themselves and justifying their thought processes helps them to understand that your expectations coming out of the class is that they have comprehension and that it's not just about the right answer. I know for my part, teaching in CUNY for as many years as I have, it's a really hard thing to break students of, is this expectation that I got the right answer, therefore that's all you need. I got it right, so I get 100. And when you begin to challenge those assumptions, it can take a while. And so working with students, when you catch them early on, maybe relying on solution strategies that are not entirely their own, as evidenced by the fact that they can't really explain justification for the steps that they take. How do we put them back on the right path? How do we help them understand what our expectations are and how they can come to meet those expectations? So I wanted to open this up. 30 minutes is an awfully short time to go over all of this. And I know I just breezed over, a lot of different things, but I'd like to take questions about identifying problems that can be solver resistant, or how to go about incorporating some of these strategies into our assessment vocabulary.
Yeah, Andrew, Ramon here.
Hey, Ramon. Yeah, I don't have any money. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, but yeah, let me finish this one, and I will ask Jake the money. No, I like the idea of the way you set up this thing. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Remember what you said. The first thing that you put integration from lower bound to upper bound,
sure,
and which gives you the numeric value. But that is just giving the answer. But what you just said now is the perfect way of asking them whether they actually understand the topic, not just giving me the answer like, oh, the answer is 2, the answer is 3. How do you use it? What is the purpose?
Sure.
I really like it. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So Drew, if I could just kind of jump in, and I put in the chat, I really loved that you mentioned, you know, this kind of the art of the oral interview, where if you ask students to walk you through their thinking for a particular problem, it's not just about focusing on them giving you back the correct procedure. It's kind of about interrupting them and asking, can you elaborate on this part? What if you had a negative sign instead of a positive sign? What if instead of sign, you had cosine? What if, and by teasing them out in this way, you're really able to get really quickly to the bottom of whether they understand the concept versus just the procedure. Yeah, so can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think as you described it, the art of the interview is a good way of putting it. Because we don't have unlimited time, and dealing with a large class size means a lot of separate interviews, and it's time consuming, and it's frankly exhausting. So I'll say, yeah, asking what if questions is excellent, especially when you see things that stand out to you as suspicious. You know, I tend to, in my interviews, not ask students about the exact exam problems. I instead put something similar in front of them, and usually oversimplified. Because we don't have a lot of time, I try to pick, you know, either pick up a problem partway through. I say, here, you're trying to do this problem and you've gotten this far, or, you know, this is like the problem you did on the exam, but I've changed it slightly. Like you said, this is a cosine instead of a sine. So where a student might have solved, you know, the integral of cosine of negative 9x by using a even odd symmetry, I say, well, how would this change if you wanted to integrate, you know, sine of negative 9x instead of cosine of negative 9x? And these are things that can tease out, you know, places where the students don't understand some of the work that they're doing. And again, the exams tend to be too long to be able to ask about everything. And so you want to be able to target specific things. And generally, I go into an exam with several particular comprehension. They're not facts, right? There's several components of understanding the topic that's being prioritized on the test. That I want to focus on. And so sometimes it's application questions, and at other times when students really struggle with procedural, you know, I tend to, you know, at least procedure, you know, it doesn't always follow comprehension, and comprehension doesn't always, you know, it's not cut and dry which one precedes which, and it's certainly different from student to student. So yeah, I still wouldn't say that I'm by any means an expert on conducting the oral interviews, but I do like to try to trim things down, and I don't let students, you know, try to solve a whole problem, and I will definitely cut them off if they're just reading to me steps. Yeah. And I will say, in response to Paul's comment, yeah, absolutely. Like, it doesn't even have to be automated problem solvers. It can just be like looking at my course notes when they do an exam, and it's like, well, you did you know, do you understand what's being done? That's always the question. Why did you think to take this step?
Andrew, I skipped your talk because I was interviewing students, but can I say a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm actually interviewing students every week this semester, not just after exams, because I felt like the interviews last semester were like eventually became like really, really good learning experiences. I'm doing this in my Calc 2 class, and I think a lot of like what if questions, kind of like Andrew was saying, is like integration by parts. What if you had made the other choice for your U and your DP? And I have, you know, sometimes I would have students who just gave me a perfect like presentation of integration by parts, and I asked them to make this one change, and they forget what integration by parts is for. You know, they start integrating the two factors. Yeah. So I feel like just like little what if questions. What if you had this instead? And once you've done a ton of them, you sort of build up a portfolio of these types of questions.
Yeah, it definitely exposes whether students have done the work. I forget that. I wish I could recall the name of the woman who was giving the presentation that has stuck with me for so long. I wish her name had stuck as well. But one of the things that she described was creating a mental map of conceptual territory. And it's part of the work of doing problems that you end up making mistakes and you find yourself in unfamiliar territory, and you have to assess whether your work is being fruitful. And you can tell when you ask students, what if this or what if that, whether they have a fleshed out conceptual map of the territory. That no, that's a bad idea because I've been down that road before. And this is a good road because it addresses these problems that happen if I go that way. And just thinking of it as a map with dead ends and like knowing where the dead ends are, like really, really stuck with me.
Yeah, I had that exact question with the integration by parts. A number of students I asked that question about flipping, and half of them were like, well, I tried that and this is what happened.
Yeah, bad things.
Yeah. I think that maybe this one might go for Jake. If I may ask, is there anything in the future, Jake, that can test towards what Andrew is suggesting? I mean, an open-ended question type that a student can just write what they're thinking in your application?
WeBWorK does support open-ended questions, but again, when you go that route, you will need to be the one who is in charge of evaluating those responses. So when we normally think of WeBWorK as like automated feedback and evaluation, open-ended questions don't fit that mold. And so one of the things I'm warning about there is just to be prepared if you go the essay answer route, that is a different component than what you're probably used to in WeBWorK.
Yeah, but what I'm saying about open-ended one, just like what Kate is saying, now, if I already have a question similar to, okay, what about if you do this one? What happens? Then we can have a discussion if you come to my oral presentation, because I've already looked at exactly what you said. Are you thinking in this way? What were you thinking when you put this in down? So maybe the students, so therefore, we don't have to be searching for a question to ask the students because they already actually prompt us into what we can ask them during the meetings.
That's true, and I will say, Ramon, I know you're aware of this, but in CUNY we definitely have a sizable proportion of students that are not native English speakers, and they do struggle with describing their thoughts or communicating their thoughts in written English, and so it can be very difficult. But you're right. I mean, if you're just using it as a springboard for the interview process, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, kind of like Drew was saying, we've talked a lot about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in our final exams demo. But yeah, it's always a balance because, you can, have written work, but then, what if it's a non-native English speaker, like how does that affect? So, it's one of those things that, once again, we'll talk more in depth. We find attaching written work to be really interesting. But, we can talk more about that a little bit later because I know we got another